The state of Victoria is headed for its worst urban crisis since the Great Depression. According to the head of the Council of Homeless Persons, we may face a potential human catastrophe. But this crisis has long been in the making and, in my opinion, the manufacturing of this crisis has served as an excuse to give away what little public housing exists to special interests in the private sector. Victoria has the lowest recurrent spending per capita on public housing and the third lowest capital spending per capita out of all of the states and territories in the country. Despite investments made by the Victorian Labor Party's big housing build, Victoria remains the state with the lowest proportion of social housing in comparison to the total housing stock. This isn't because people are doing well. More than 55,000 households, meaning well over 100,000 people, are on the public housing waiting list, and the homeless population is only growing. It is in this context that the Victorian Labor Party gave Harriet Shing the housing ministerial portfolio. In 2014, Harriet Shing was elected to the Legislative Council to represent the Eastern Victoria region. Throughout her career, she's had hits such as backing a waste-to-energy facility based on a confidential feasibility study funded in part by the company seeking to build the facility, because Nippon Paper is so concerned with the environment, right? This one's a classic. Harriet Shing was actively censoring Victoria's anti-corruption body IBAC. When she was chairing one of the meetings, she kept interrupting the witness when they began to talk about Daniel Andrews in relation to the ongoing corruption investigations, even at one point ordering that the broadcasters, quote, cut the feed after the witness was asked about Dan again. We later find out that Harriet Shing was dating Daniel Andrews' chief of staff. And finally, in relation to this particular issue, despite leaving Premier Jacinta Allen under the impression that a parliamentary inquiry into the demolition of Victoria's public housing towers didn't have the numbers, and being specifically briefed on getting the crossbench on board with it, Harriet Shing failed to get the crossbench to block the inquiry, now meaning we have an actual public inquiry that's due to come later this year. So thanks to her incompetence, we now have an inquiry into Victorian Labor's shady demolition and privatisation plans. To quote some of the party hacks, timing couldn't be worse. But before we talk about sellout Shing, let's give some historical context. In 1988, under the Kane Labor government, the public housing waiting list had risen by 136%. Since the early 1990s, respective governments have been getting reports from the Auditor General warning of the deteriorating conditions and lacking public housing supply. In 1993, under the Kennett Liberal government, the Auditor General was concerned that the Office of Housing faced a mounting maintenance liability, a problem that was further compounded by the absence of a replacement plan for aging and inappropriate properties. In addition, repairs were not dealt with in a timely manner, complaints were poorly handled, and the implementation of policy and standards of performance differed across the organisation. 10 years later, in 2002, under the Bracks Labor government, little had changed, and the Auditor General found that the Office of Housing cannot be certain all work it paid for has been provided, that the work meets the required standard and was performed within the required timeframe. Little changed through the Brumby Labor government, then the Napthine and Bailey Liberal governments, with public housing stock management and provision in Victoria coming under sustained criticism in numerous inquiries and reports since 2008. The Productivity Commission, Auditor General, and the Victorian Parliament have each documented concern about the quality and quantity of public housing, the systems in place to manage built assets and tenancies, and the appropriateness of policy frameworks to provide low-income housing in Victoria. Victoria's public housing has been neglected for nearly half a century. Ambitious and bold action is therefore required. However, when you see government officials flanked with vested interests in property and investment spruiking urban renewal, you should be concerned. But before we go over what's happening, we need to define some terms, because the Victorian Labor Party deliberately relies on obfuscation to muddle the conversation. Public housing refers to government-owned and managed housing, where rents are capped at 25% of the tenant's income. Community housing refers to housing owned by a range of different organizations. So you have the standard community housing organization or CHOs, non-governmental organizations, non-for-profits, charities, etc. Now, while these community housing organizations advertise themselves as not-for-profits, rents are typically higher, conditions are worse, and the processes of consultation, complaints, and repairs are often worse and more opaque compared to public housing, which they're already bad enough. Other thing to note is that this sector has been increasingly drawing the attention of big financial players in superannuation, notably codified in the National Housing Accord by Albanese in 2022, but has been going on for a while now. So CHOs are and will be increasingly pressured to pay back commercial loans acquired from superannuation. Together, public and community housing are what's called social housing. So when you hear politicians and people in media talking about social housing, they're inadvertently including that commercialized community housing, and more often than not, that community housing part is more of what they're talking about. When politicians are asked about public housing specifically, that being government-owned housing capped at 25% of people's incomes, and they start talking about social housing, they are intentionally lying to you. Here is an example of Harriet Shing doing exactly that.
Is making moves in that area. My question is 10% okay, but 20% of the big build partnership for public housing would be better? So allocating 20% of the new builds for public housing, would that be a better solution given our supply issues at the moment?
So there's a few things in that. Thank you for that question. So the big housing build itself, that's $5.3 billion, and that's about delivering 12,000 new social homes across the state, and there's an additional $1 billion for at least 1,300 homes across rural and regional Victoria. So that's that figure there, and we are in the process of delivering that. We've allocated about 60% of that fund, which has delivered. We've got around 9,800 homes that are either complete in building or in planning stages, and we have seen thousands of families move into those new homes, including singles and couples and including older people. We're also working to deliver those partnerships as part of what we do through the housing statement, which I think is where you were going with what mixed development looks like. And this is where we need to partner with developers, with institutional investors, with those peak bodies and the stakeholders who are looking to make sure that as we lean into the challenges of population growth, and here in Melbourne we will see a population the size of London by 2050, that we have opportunities for people to live within communities. And when we talk to the uplift in social housing, again, we're talking about, I'll give the example of the Towers redevelopment. So that's 44 sites, and that will involve an uplift of 10% in social housing.
Now, I go over it in detail in this video here, but essentially the Victorian Labor Party since around 2017 have been trying to completely rehaul or renew public housing in this country. While there were pilot projects of this sort before, the Public Housing Renewal Program, or PHRP, was the first sort of systematic policy agenda which explicitly sought to demolish and reconstruct public housing estates into what's called socially mixed estates. Essentially, social mix refers to the theory that if you scatter or pepper poor, typically public housing tenants, amongst higher to middle income areas, you'll reduce poverty and neighborhood deprivation. It sounds nice in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. As put by urban planning academic Dr. Libby Porter, it's a hypothesis that blames the places where poverty is rather than its structural causes, as if poverty is contagious rather than produced. In fact, out of the over 800 academic articles, 800 available on social mix, a whopping total of zero support the implementation of social mix policies. In fact, we have our own local pilot project example here in Melbourne. A government inquiry into the social mix model on the Kensington estate said that we should continue to expand and eventually generalize this model across the entire... They said that the redevelopment model at Kensington should not be reproduced in the same arrangement on other estates. That's about as damning as a report can get. Despite these damning findings, the Victorian government has continued to apply the social mix model, now through its ground lease policy, onto the public housing towers redevelopment, the towers it seeks to demolish. Now again, I go into it more here, but essentially the reason this happens is because the social mix model relies on private investment for the middle to high income part of the housing equation. So when you remodel an estate or a block of housing where 70% of the flats are owned privately or by community housing organizations, most of that land is going to be geared towards generating profit for developers, investors, or paying back loans to for-profit superannuation firms. What should be a public good, something outside of or shielded from market forces, that being public housing for society's most vulnerable, is being outsourced to the private sector. And as we've seen in Victoria, where this approach has been the most extensive of such in the country, we lag behind significantly. As I mentioned, Victoria has the lowest proportion of social housing stock in the country. It has some of the lowest recurrent and capital expenditure in the country, and this is despite a growing waiting list and growing homeless population. Because Victorian Labor have capitulated to these vested interests, allowing them to run an incredibly deprived social housing sector, the government has only built 300 public homes in a decade since coming to office. For context, the previous Liberal government built 1,000 homes in its 4-year term between 2008 and 2014, which Labor Treasurer Tim Pallas rightly criticised them for being too conservative. If the dumpster fire that Vic Libs are beating you at anything, just quit whatever you're doing. Quit politics, just leave.
I've compared the Victorian Liberal Party to a bin on a street corner that is on fire plenty of times, and I've never been proven wrong in that assessment of the Victorian Liberals.
As put by Noam Chomsky,
there's a standard way of privatising something, like when Margaret Thatcher wanted to privatize the British railroads. The technique was defund them, and then when they don't work, people get angry. They say, let's do something. So you hand it over to private enterprise, which totally ruins them, and then the state has to come back in.
This point counters every Labor member that supports the demolition. Some don't, shout out Labor for housing. When talking to these people, they have the exact same robotic script of the towers are dilapidated, they must come down, they must be demolished, they must be outsourced to the private sector. It's an insanely partisan and reductive view in light of everything we've just gone over, which can only be boiled down to the fact that they were given marching orders to ignore the vast swaths of literature which contradict the government's policies. But why are the higher-ups writing these orders? Who's actually in the room when the government designs its housing policy? Let's ask Housing Minister Harriet Shing. When asked about the criticism surrounding the government's housing statement, which basically is the sort of big goals the government wants to get done across the housing market, which includes the demolition of the public housing towers, Shing said this.
It's actually more important to hear people coming up with ideas and solutions and suggestions. And when we announced the housing statement, there was an affordability partnership, and this involves peak bodies, so the Property Council, the Master Builders Association, working across the super funds, for example, and making sure that we have buy-in from every part of the system.
You can go to the clip, links in the description, you can go watch the full podcast. Nowhere is consultation with residents or academics mentioned regarding the demolition of the towers. Rather, Shing is working with peak bodies like the Property Council, Master Builders and Superannuation Funds, i.e. organisations which represent for-profit developers and investors. In contrast, we can see Harriet Shing celebrate the recent court decision that deemed the Labor Party's demolitions to be lawful, reasonable and justified. That ruling specifically reaffirmed the right of the government to not consult with public housing tenants. Straight up, Harriet Shing is celebrating the fact that the courts reaffirmed her right to demolish Victorian public housing without even consulting the actual people who live there in any manner whatsoever. To the contrary, sellout Shing boasts about all of her industry connections with the Property Council, Master Builders and Superannuation and their involvement in the decision-making process. Just know that if you live in a public home, she won't talk to you. She prefers her mates in Master Builders, in the Property Council, in superannuation. We can see this in the limited documentation publicly available. As early as 2023, before Harriet Shing was given the housing portfolio, this document revealed who's in the room with the government when discussing the tower demolitions, and as you can see, it's a bunch of superannuation firms and their real estate arms. When getting advice on the particulars, it wasn't urban planning academics or economists or sociologists the government went to, rather, they went to one of the big four accounting firms, Ernst & Young. Homes Victoria engaged EY for the provision of real estate advisory and commercial financial support in relation to the regeneration of several Homes Victoria high-density sites within Melbourne. Now, speaking of that other document, here we can see IFM Investors and their subsidiary ISPT Property. IFM is a big conglomerate in the investment and superannuation world, and they've been a pretty big proponent of superannuation investment into community housing. IFM is chaired by a certain Kath Bowtell, who was a failed Labor candidate for the seat of Melbourne, and has been seen going out for dinners with Harriet Shing. As we can see from Harriet Shing's publicised ministerial diaries, her days have been littered with meetings featuring numerous representatives from IFM Investors. One of these entries reveals that Harriet Shing met once, literally once, on the 21st of June 2024 with the vague Flemington residents to discuss housing matters. Of course, Victoria's housing statement earmarking the Flemington estate for demolition was announced a year earlier, and as we saw from those documents, the process and advice acquired predated even that. In fact, literally the same day as that meeting, right afterwards, Harriet Shing had a big grand meeting with, you guessed it, IFM investors present. This is who the government and Harriet Shing are talking to. They're not talking to you, they're not talking to public housing residents, they're not talking to experts, they're talking to big financial consultants and investors looking to make a cheap buck from prime inner city land. Harriet Shing should either resign or completely abandon the demolition of the public housing towers. We need a multi-pronged campaign to stop these demolitions. The Flemington and North Melbourne towers are slated to be demolished later this year, and so I want to help contribute to a vibrant campaign. I'm going to be posting much more about the towers, about public housing, about the Victorian Labor Party. Please, if you can, donate to the Patreon if you want this to continue in hopes of something coming out of it. Go follow the Renters and Housing Union, the Victorian Greens, the Victorian Socialists. They're all groups trying to save Victoria's public housing, and any announcements about demonstrations or developments will be reported on by them. If you're in the Labor Party, join Labor for Housing, bring this stuff up a branch, and if you're in a union, try and do the same. We've got to keep public housing. We can't let private investors chasing a profit be the ones taking care of those who need housing the most.